The glass towers of downtown reflected the morning sun like mirrors of ambition, and somewhere in one of those gleaming buildings, a man was about to learn that cruelty has a price. Whether you're watching this from New York, Los Angeles, or a small town anywhere in between, you've probably seen this type of boss before. The kind who mistakes power for character and confuses fear with respect. Marcus Chin stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his corner office, surveying his kingdom of code and commerce. At 38, he had built TechFlow Solutions from a garage startup into a $100 million enterprise, and he never let anyone forget it. His tailored suits cost more than most people's monthly rent, his watch could fund a small business, and his ego could fill the entire 42nd floor. The morning light caught the edges of his perfectly styled hair as he turned away from the window, his attention drawn to the soft ping of the elevator doors opening in the main workspace below. Through the glass walls of his office, he watched David Martinez emerge, shoulders hunched with exhaustion, dark circles under his eyes telling the story of another sleepless night. David was everything Marcus had once been but refused to remember. Brilliant with code, innovative with solutions, but quietly humble in a way that Marcus now viewed as weakness. At 35, David had been with the company for 6 years, consistently delivering exceptional work while never demanding the spotlight. His code was elegant, his debugging skills legendary among the team, and his ability to solve complex problems had saved the company millions in potential losses. But Marcus only saw what David lacked: the aggressive hunger for recognition, the willingness to step on others, the killer instinct that Marcus believed had made him successful. David's footsteps moved quickly across the polished concrete floor, his laptop bag sliding off his shoulder as he hurried toward his workstation. He was 43 minutes late, and in Marcus's world, that was 43 minutes of disrespect. Marcus pressed the intercom button that connected his office to the main workspace, his voice cutting through the quiet morning atmosphere like a blade. "David, my office. Now." The 20 other developers in the open workspace looked up from their monitors, their faces already showing the familiar tension that preceded one of Marcus's public displays of authority. They had witnessed these moments before, and they knew the script that was about to unfold. David's shoulders sagged slightly as he heard the summons, but he straightened them with visible effort and changed direction toward the corner office. His reflection in the glass walls showed a man carrying more than just professional responsibility. His clothes were wrinkled from a night spent in a hospital waiting room, his hair disheveled from running his hands through it during hours of worry. Marcus had already positioned himself behind his massive desk by the time David knocked softly on the open door frame. "Come in and shut the door," Marcus commanded without looking up from his computer screen, letting the silence stretch long enough to establish dominance. David stepped inside and closed the door, the soft click seeming to seal him inside a chamber of judgment. He remained standing, knowing that Marcus preferred to keep these encounters formal and uncomfortable. Finally, Marcus looked up, his dark eyes cold and calculating. 43 minutes, David. 43 minutes of company time that you've stolen from me this morning." His voice was calm, which somehow made it more menacing than if he had been shouting. David opened his mouth to explain, but Marcus held up a perfectly manicured hand to silence him. "I don't want to hear about traffic or car trouble or whatever excuse you've prepared," Marcus continued, rising slowly from his chair like a predator preparing to strike. "What I want to know is why you think the rules don't apply to you." The unfairness of the accusation stung David more than anger would have. He had never asked for special treatment, never demanded exceptions, never even taken a sick day in 3 years. But Elena had been doubled over in agony at 4 in the morning, her face pale and her body shaking with fever, and he couldn't leave her alone to suffer. Marcus walked around the desk, his Italian leather shoes clicking against the hardwood floor of his office. He stopped directly in front of David, close enough that the scent of his expensive cologne mixed with the faint smell of fierce sweat from his victim. "You see, David," Marcus said, his voice dropping to a conversational tone that was somehow more threatening than yelling. "I've built this company on excellence, on accountability, on the understanding that when you work for me, my time becomes the most valuable thing in your life." He paused, letting the words sink in while his eyes studied David's face for signs of rebellion or weakness. When David remained silent, Marcus interpreted it as submission and continued his verbal assault. But you don't seem to understand that concept, Marcus continued, beginning to pace in a small circle around David like a shark circling wounded prey. You stroll in here whenever you feel like it, as if the success of this company depends on your convenience rather than your commitment. Sir, David finally spoke, his voice quiet but steady. My wife was sick this morning. I had to make sure she was okay before I could leave for work. She was vomiting and had a high fever, and I couldn't just abandon her when she needed medical attention. Marcus stopped pacing and turned to face David directly, a smile spreading across his face that held no warmth whatsoever. Ah yes, your wife, he said, drawing out the words like they tasted bitter in his mouth. Elena, isn't it? The woman who seems to have a remarkable talent for having emergencies right when you're supposed to be here earning your salary. David's jaw tightened at the implication, but he forced himself to remain calm. She's never been seriously ill before, sir. This was genuinely an emergency situation that required immediate attention. Marcus returned to his desk and leaned against it casually, his posture suggesting that he was enjoying this conversation far more than he should. Tell me, David, he said, his tone becoming almost conversational. What exactly does your wife do for a living? Because I'm curious about what kind of work schedule allows someone to have so many convenient emergencies. The question hit David like a physical blow because it touched on one of his deepest sources of stress and shame. Elena had been forced to leave her previous job to care for her elderly mother during her final months, and since then, she had been struggling to find new employment that could accommodate David's demanding schedule and their financial needs. She's between positions right now, David replied carefully, trying to keep any defensiveness out of his voice. She's been interviewing and looking for opportunities, but the job market has been challenging lately. Marcus's smile widened into something predatory and cruel. So what you're telling me is that I'm supporting not just you, but also your unemployed wife who can't seem to manage her health well enough to let you do your job, he said, his voice carrying clearly through the glass walls of his office. Several of the developers in the workspace had stopped pretending to work and were watching the exchange with growing discomfort. They could see David's face reddening with humiliation and Marcus's obvious pleasure in delivering it. That's not fair, sir, David said, his voice gaining strength from indignation. Elena is a talented and capable person who has been dealing with family obligations and health issues beyond her control. She doesn't deserve to be characterized that way. Marcus pushed himself off the desk and stood to his full height, his expression shifting from amusement to cold anger. Fair, he repeated, as if the word itself was an insult. You want to talk about fair? Let me tell you what's fair, David. He walked back around to his chair, but remained standing, his hands planted firmly on the desk's surface as he leaned forward like a judge preparing to deliver a sentence. Fair is when I pay someone $80,000 a year to be here when I need them, Marcus continued, his voice rising just enough to ensure that everyone in the workspace could hear every word. Fair is when that person understands that their personal problems don't get to interfere with their professional responsibilities. Fair is when someone shows me the respect I deserve as the person who signs their paycheck. David felt his heart sinking as he realized where this conversation was heading, but he tried one more time to salvage the situation. I understand your frustration, sir, and I take full responsibility for being late this morning. It won't happen again, and I'm prepared to stay late tonight to make up for any lost time. Marcus straightened up slowly, his eyes never leaving David's face as he savored the moment of absolute power he was about to exercise. That's a generous offer, David, he said, his voice dripping with false appreciation. But I'm afraid I'm going to have to decline. The silence in the office stretched like a taut wire as Marcus let the implications of his words sink in. Through the glass walls, the other employees had completely abandoned any pretense of working and were watching the scene unfold with the morbid fascination of witnesses to a public execution. You see, David, Marcus continued, moving around the desk once again to position himself directly in front of his victim, I've been thinking lately about the concept of dead weight. About employees who coast along thinking that their past contributions give them license to slack off in the present. David's face had gone pale as the reality of the situation became undeniable, but he stood straighter rather than shrinking under the assault. His hands clenched into fists at his sides, not in preparation for violence, but as an anchor against the storm of humiliation washing over him. "And I've decided," Marcus said, his voice becoming almost cheerful with satisfaction, "that TechFlow Solutions can no longer afford to carry employees who put their personal dramas ahead of their professional obligations." The words that followed hit David like a physical blow, even though he had seen them coming. "You're fired, David. Effective immediately. Your access cards will be deactivated within the hour, and I'll need you to pack up your personal belongings and leave the building before lunch." The cruelty of the dismissal was amplified by Marcus's obvious enjoyment of it, and by the fact that it was being delivered in full view of David's colleagues and friends. But Marcus wasn't finished with his performance. "And let me give you some advice for your next job search," Marcus added, his voice carrying clearly through the glass walls to ensure maximum humiliation. "Maybe look for employers who are more understanding of personal emergencies. I hear retail and food service are more flexible about employee reliability." David stood frozen for a moment, his mind struggling to process the complete destruction of his livelihood and dignity that had just occurred. But when he finally spoke, his voice was steady and controlled, revealing a core of strength that Marcus had failed to recognize or break. "I understand, sir," David said simply. "I'll gather my things and be out within the hour." Marcus had been expecting pleas, arguments, or at least visible devastation, and David's calm acceptance seemed to disappoint him slightly. But he quickly recovered his satisfaction and moved toward his office door, clearly intending to make sure the entire workspace witnessed the conclusion of his demonstration. He opened the door and stepped out into the main work area, his voice carrying across the open floor plan with obvious pleasure. "Let this be a lesson to everyone," Marcus announced, his eyes scanning the faces of the remaining employees. "I don't tolerate weakness, excuses, or divided loyalties. When you work for TechFlow Solutions, this company comes first, second, and third in your priorities." David emerged from the office behind Marcus, his face composed despite the destruction that had just been visited upon him. He walked slowly to his desk while his colleagues watched with a mixture of sympathy and relief that they had not been the target. As David began placing his few personal items into a cardboard box that someone had quietly provided, Marcus continued his victory speech. "Success demands sacrifice," Marcus declared, his voice filled with self-righteousness. "It requires the discipline to put business ahead of personal convenience. Those who can't meet that standard have no place in a company that's building the future." The quiet packing continued as David carefully removed photos of Elena, a small plant she had given him, and the few personal touches that had made his workstation feel human. His movements were deliberate and dignified, refusing to give Marcus the satisfaction of seeing him hurry or panic. "Remember this moment," Marcus concluded, his arms crossed as he surveyed his domain with obvious satisfaction. "Excellence isn't negotiable, and neither is loyalty. The next time any of you think about putting your personal lives ahead of your responsibilities to this company, think about David's empty desk." David finished packing in absolute silence, his colleagues watching helplessly as 6 years of dedicated service was reduced to a few items in a small box. When he stood to leave, several people started to approach him, but Marcus's presence made it clear that any show of support would be noted and remembered. As David walked toward the elevator, his head held high despite everything, Marcus called out one final humiliation. "Oh, and David," he said loudly enough for everyone to hear, "when you're updating your resume, maybe leave off the part about being unable to balance work and family responsibilities. Future employers might find that concerning." The elevator doors closed on David's composed face, and Marcus turned back to his traumatized workforce with evident satisfaction. "Now," he announced, clapping his hands together once, "let's get back to building something great." But in the silence that followed, something had shifted in the office atmosphere. The remaining employees returned to their work with a new understanding of exactly what kind of man they were working for, and several of them were already wondering if David's calm dignity in the face of cruelty might be a strength rather than a weakness. Marcus returned to his office, completely unaware that his moment of triumph had planted the seeds of his own destruction, and that the quiet woman he had mocked was about to teach him that underestimating people can be a very expensive mistake. Should I continue with Chapter 2? Please let me know when you're ready for me to proceed to the next chapter. The sound of David's key turning in the lock of their small apartment echoed through the hallway like a funeral bell. Elena looked up from the couch where she had been resting, still pale from her morning illness, and immediately knew from her husband's posture that her worst fears had been realized. David stood in the doorway holding a cardboard box that contained 6 years of his professional life, his shoulders sagging under the weight of something far heavier than office supplies and personal photographs. His eyes met hers across the modest living room they had furnished with careful budgeting and weekend trips to thrift stores, and she saw the devastating combination of shame, anger, and helplessness that no man should have to carry. Elena rose slowly from the couch, her legs still unsteady from the morning's bout of food poisoning that had been triggered by stress about their mounting medical bills and uncertain future. But her husband's need was greater than her physical weakness, and she crossed the room to wrap her arms around him before he could say a word. "He's gone and done it," David whispered against her hair, his voice breaking on the words he had been practicing during the entire drive home. "Marcus fired me, Elena, right there in front of everyone, like I was some kind of criminal or failure." Elena held him tighter, feeling the tremor in his muscles as 6 years of suppressed frustration and humiliation finally found their release. She had known this day might come, had seen the signs in Marcus's increasing cruelty and her husband's growing stress, but the reality still hit her like a physical blow. "Tell me what happened," she said softly, guiding him toward the couch and taking the box from his hands with gentle care. "Tell me everything, and don't leave anything out because I need to understand exactly what we're dealing with." David sank into the worn cushions and began recounting the morning's events, his voice gaining strength as he shared the burden that had been crushing him. Elena listened without interruption, her face growing colder with each detail of Marcus's calculated cruelty, her mind already beginning to work on problems and solutions that David couldn't yet imagine. When he finished the story, they sat in silence for several minutes, holding hands while the afternoon sunlight streamed through their small windows and illuminated the modest life they had built together. Elena's thumb traced gentle circles on David's knuckles, a gesture of comfort that had sustained them through her mother's illness, his previous job stresses, and all the small struggles of a couple trying to build something meaningful on love rather than money. "We're going to be okay," she said finally, her voice carrying a quiet confidence that seemed impossible given their circumstances. "I know it doesn't feel like it right now, but Marcus Chun has just made the biggest mistake of his professional life." David looked at her with surprise and a touch of concern, wondering if the stress was affecting her judgment. "Honey, I don't think you understand how powerful Marcus is in this industry," he said gently. "He's got connections everywhere, contracts with major companies, relationships that go back years. One word from him can close doors before I even know they exist." Elena smiled, and for just a moment, something flickered behind her eyes that looked remarkably like anticipation rather than worry. "Then trust me when I say that some doors are about to open that Marcus Chun doesn't even know exist," she replied cryptically. Before David could ask what she meant, Elena's phone rang with the distinctive tone she had assigned to unknown numbers. She glanced at the caller ID and stood quickly, moving toward the bedroom with an urgency that seemed oddly practiced. "I need to take this call," she said over her shoulder. "Why don't you start looking through job listings online while I handle some things? We're going to need to move quickly on several fronts." David heard her voice through the bedroom door, speaking in low, professional tones that seemed strangely authoritative for someone discussing household emergencies or family matters. The conversation lasted nearly 20 minutes, punctuated by long pauses where Elena seemed to be listening to detailed information and occasionally asking sharp, specific questions that suggested familiarity with complex business processes. When she emerged, Elena was carrying a leather portfolio that David had never seen before, along with what appeared to be official documents that she quickly placed in their small home safe. Her movements were efficient and purposeful, as if she was executing a plan that had been prepared long in advance. Meanwhile, across the city, Marcus Chun was making his own phone calls from the comfort of his corner office. His contact list read like a directory of the region's most influential technology executives, and he was systematically working through it with the satisfaction of a hunter checking his traps. The conversation with Robert Kim at Innovative Systems was typical of the dozen calls Marcus had already made that afternoon. "Robert, It's Marcus Chun from TechFlow Solutions. He began with practiced friendliness. I wanted to give you a heads up about a former employee who might be approaching you for opportunities. Marcus leaned back in his leather chair as he delivered his carefully crafted character assassination. David Martinez was with us for several years, but we had to let him go this morning for reliability issues and divided loyalties. Great technical skills, but unfortunately his personal life kept interfering with his professional responsibilities. The damage was subtle but devastating, delivered in tones of regret and professional concern that made it seem like Marcus was reluctantly sharing confidential information for Robert's benefit. By the time he finished the call, David's reputation had been poisoned at another major employer, and Marcus's network would ensure the story spread through informal channels faster than any official job application could travel. Elena returned to the living room to find David staring at his laptop screen with growing frustration. Every major company in the city seemed to have already removed their job postings, and the few positions that remained were either far below his skill level or located in distant cities that would require expensive relocation. "This doesn't make sense," David muttered, refreshing the job search page for the third time in 10 minutes. Yesterday there were dozens of senior developer positions available, and now it's like they've all disappeared overnight. Elena sat beside him and glanced at the screen, her expression suggesting she understood exactly what was happening even if she couldn't explain it yet. "Marcus is making calls," she said matter-of-factly. "He's using his network to close doors before you can even approach them." The realization hit David like a cold wave, and he felt the full weight of his powerlessness settling over him like a suffocating blanket. "But how do we fight something like that?" he asked desperately. "How do I compete against someone who can destroy my reputation with a phone call?" Elena placed her hand over his on the laptop keyboard, her touch gentle but somehow commanding. "You don't fight it," she said quietly. "You go around it. And sometimes you go over it. And occasionally, if you're very careful and very smart, you go right through the middle of it." Before David could ask what she meant, Elena's phone buzzed with a text message that caused her to stand abruptly and move toward the kitchen. The message was brief, but seemed to carry enormous significance, and Elena's fingers moved quickly as she typed a response that was clearly much longer than casual conversation. The next morning brought the humiliation into sharp public focus when David and Elena made their weekly trip to the grocery store. Elena had insisted they maintain their normal routines despite the crisis, but she had also quietly retrieved a small plastic card from her wallet that David had never seen her use before. As they moved through the aisles of their neighborhood market, Elena filled their cart with the same careful selections they always made, balancing nutrition against cost with the skill of someone who had learned to make every dollar stretch. But when they reached the checkout line, David noticed several familiar faces from his former workplace doing their own weekend shopping. The cashier's voice carried clearly across the checkout area as Elena presented her payment method. "Thank you for using your SNAP benefits today," the young woman said with professional courtesy. "You have a remaining balance of $237 for this month." David felt his face burning with shame as he realized that their former colleagues had heard every word, and he could see the mixture of pity and uncomfortable recognition in their eyes. Elena, however, seemed completely unfazed by the attention, handling the transaction with quiet dignity, as if financial assistance was simply another practical tool rather than a source of embarrassment. Tom Wilson from the development team approached them hesitantly as they loaded their groceries into bags. "Hey, David," he said awkwardly, his eyes darting between David's face and the food stamp card Elena was returning to her wallet. "I heard about what happened yesterday. That was really rough, man." David managed a weak smile and a nod, but Elena stepped forward with warm confidence. "Tom, it's so nice to see you," she said genuinely. "David's told me wonderful things about working with you over the years. I hope you're doing well at the company." Tom shifted uncomfortably, clearly struggling with the disconnect between Elena's gracious manner and their obvious financial distress. "Yeah, well, you know how it is," he mumbled. "Marcus has been pretty intense lately. We're all just trying to keep our heads down and do our work." Elena's smile never wavered, but something in her eyes suggested she was filing away that information for future reference. "That sounds very wise," she replied pleasantly. "Sometimes the best strategy is to observe carefully and choose your moments thoughtfully." The conversation ended with awkward pleasantries, But David could feel the weight of his former colleague's stares as he and Elena made their way to the parking lot. The ride home was quiet, with David wrestling with the shame of his reduced circumstances while Elena seemed lost in thought about matters she hadn't shared. That evening, as David continued his increasingly futile job search, Elena received a priority mail delivery that required her signature. The thick envelope bore the return address of a prestigious law firm in the city's financial district, and Elena signed for it with the practiced ease of someone accustomed to receiving important legal documents. David glanced up from his laptop as Elena opened the envelope carefully, her eyes scanning documents that appeared to be contracts or agreements of some kind. The papers were dense with legal language and official seals, suggesting matters of significant importance and complexity. "Everything okay, honey?" David asked, noting the serious expression on Elena's face as she read through the documents. Elena looked up with a smile that seemed to contain secrets. "Everything's going to be better than okay," she replied, folding the documents carefully and placing them in her leather portfolio. "I just need to handle a few more details, and then we can start moving forward with some new opportunities." Meanwhile, Marcus Chun was celebrating his successful character assassination campaign with a self-congratulatory post on LinkedIn that would soon become evidence of his own professional destruction. The post, titled "Raising Standards and Making Difficult Decisions," outlined his philosophy of aggressive leadership and zero tolerance for employees who couldn't meet his demanding expectations. "Sometimes leadership means making the hard choices that others are afraid to make," Marcus wrote with obvious satisfaction. "Today I had to terminate an employee who consistently put personal drama ahead of professional responsibilities. It's never easy to let someone go, but building a world-class team requires unwavering commitment to excellence." The post received dozens of likes and supportive comments from other executives who admired Marcus's tough stance, not realizing they were applauding the very behavior that would soon destroy him. Marcus responded to each comment with gracious appreciation, building a public record of his cruel treatment of David that Elena was quietly documenting for future use. As the weekend continued, David's savings account dwindled toward zero while Elena made increasingly frequent and mysterious phone calls. Her conversations were always conducted in private, often lasting for an hour or more, and always seemed to leave her energized and focused rather than stressed or worried. By Sunday evening, David was seriously considering applications for minimum wage positions at retail stores and restaurants, his pride crumbling under the weight of financial necessity. The apartment's atmosphere was heavy with unspoken fears about rent payments, utility bills, and the medical expenses that had triggered Elena's stress-induced illness. Elena found him staring at an application for a night shift stocking position at a local grocery store, his shoulders slumped in defeat as he contemplated the destruction of everything he had worked to build. She sat beside him on the couch and gently closed the laptop, taking his hands in hers with the tenderness of someone about to share either devastating news or miraculous hope. "David," she said softly, looking directly into his eyes with an intensity that commanded his complete attention. "I need you to trust me for just a little while longer. I know how hard this is, and I know how scared you are about our future. But I promise you that Marcus Chun is about to learn that some people are much more dangerous when they're underestimated." David searched her face for clues about what she meant, seeing a confidence and determination that seemed impossible given their circumstances. "How can you be so sure?" he asked quietly. "What aren't you telling me about our situation?" Elena smiled, and for the first time since his firing, David saw genuine happiness in her expression rather than forced optimism. "What I'm telling you," she said with quiet certainty, "is that I'm about to handle everything. And when I'm finished, Marcus Chun is going to wish he had treated you with the respect you deserved." Before David could press for more details, Elena stood and moved toward their bedroom, calling over her shoulder that she needed to make one more important phone call. Through the thin walls, David could hear her voice taking on the authoritative tone that had become increasingly familiar, though he still couldn't understand what business she might be conducting or with whom. As Sunday night settled over their small apartment, David drifted off to sleep with Elena's promise echoing in his mind, unaware that across the city, the wheels of justice were already turning with the precision of a Swiss watch and the inevitability of gravity. Marcus Chun slept soundly in his luxury penthouse, completely unaware that his empire was about to be systematically dismantled by the quiet woman he had dismissed as powerless deadweight. The stage was set for a reversal that would shock the entire industry and redefine everyone's understanding of power, patience, and the devastating consequences of underestimating the wrong person. Should I continue with Chapter 3? Please let me know when you're ready for me to proceed to the next chapter. The crystal chandeliers of the grand ballroom at the Metropolitan Hotel cast rainbow patterns across the assembled crowd of technology executives, venture capitalists, and industry luminaries who had gathered to celebrate TechFlow Solutions' record-breaking quarterly performance. Marcus Chin stood at the podium in his $1,500 tuxedo, basking in the applause that followed his announcement of 47% profit growth and the successful elimination of what he termed operational inefficiencies. "Ladies and gentlemen," Marcus declared into the microphone, his voice carrying the confidence of a man who believed he had conquered every challenge the business world could present. "This quarter's results prove that decisive leadership and unwavering standards create unstoppable momentum." The audience of investors and competitors raised their champagne glasses in tribute to Marcus's apparent genius, while he soaked up their admiration like a plant absorbing sunlight. Behind him, a massive screen displayed charts and graphs that told the story of TechFlow's meteoric rise under his guidance, each data point carefully selected to reinforce his narrative of visionary leadership. Marcus had spent weeks preparing this presentation, crafting every word to maximize his personal credit while minimizing any mention of the talented employees who had actually generated the innovations and solved the problems that drove the company's success. David Martinez's contributions had been completely erased from the corporate history, as if his 6 years of exceptional work had never existed. "Our recent restructuring efforts," Marcus continued with obvious satisfaction, "have demonstrated that sometimes the most compassionate thing a leader can do is remove team members who lack the commitment necessary for excellence. Cutting dead weight isn't just good business, it's a moral imperative." The irony was lost on the audience, but it would have devastated David to hear his termination described as an act of compassion. Marcus's speech painted a picture of a CEO who made difficult decisions for the greater good, rather than a petty tyrant who destroyed lives to feed his ego. As Marcus concluded his remarks to thunderous applause, none of the celebrating executives noticed the quiet woman in an elegant black dress who sat at a corner table, taking careful notes while speaking occasionally into a discreet Bluetooth earpiece. Elena Martinez had purchased her ticket to the event through a shell company, using credentials that would have shocked everyone in the room if they had bothered to investigate her background. She watched Marcus's performance with the clinical detachment of a surgeon studying a patient, noting every boastful claim and cruel characterization for future reference. Her presence at the celebration was not accidental or emotional, but part of a carefully orchestrated strategy that had been months in the planning. While Marcus schmutzed with potential investors and basked in their praise, Elena excused herself to make a private phone call from the hotel's business center. Her conversation was brief but intense, filled with specific instructions about stock purchases, legal filings, and timing that needed to be executed with precision. Marcus returned to TechFlow's offices the following Monday with renewed confidence and an expanded sense of his own importance. The weekend's celebration had reinforced his belief that he was untouchable, that his success was entirely self-generated, and that anyone who challenged his authority would be crushed as easily as David had been. His assistant greeted him with the usual stack of documents requiring his attention, but Marcus was too energized by his recent triumph to focus on mundane administrative matters. Instead, he spent the morning making calls to industry publications, offering interviews about his leadership philosophy and the innovative management techniques that had driven TechFlow's remarkable growth. Meanwhile, in a series of discrete transactions occurring across multiple financial institutions, an anonymous investor was systematically purchasing shares of TechFlow Solutions through a complex network of shell corporations and investment vehicles. The buying was careful and methodical, designed to accumulate significant holdings without triggering the reporting requirements that would alert Marcus to the growing threat to his control. Elena spent that Monday morning in meetings with lawyers, accountants, and financial advisors whose credentials would have impressed even Marcus if he had known about them. Her calendar was packed with appointments that David assumed were related to job hunting or managing their reduced household budget, but which actually involved coordinating a corporate acquisition strategy worth tens of millions of dollars. David himself was struggling through another day of rejection and disappointment, his job search yielding nothing but automated rejection emails and unreturned phone calls. Marcus's character assassination campaign had been devastatingly effective, and David was beginning to face the reality that he might need to consider changing industries entirely to escape his destroyed reputation. By Tuesday morning, the anonymous investor had accumulated nearly 15% of TechFlow Solutions' outstanding shares, but the purchases were so carefully distributed across different entities that no single transaction had been large enough to trigger disclosure requirements. Marcus remained completely unaware that his company was being quietly dismantled from within by forces he couldn't see or understand. Elena's daily routine had become a masterpiece of deception, as she left their apartment each morning dressed in the modest clothes of someone running errands or attending job interviews, only to transform into the sophisticated executive who was orchestrating Marcus's downfall. Her briefcase contained documents that would have revealed her true identity, but David never thought to question why his unemployed wife needed such professional accessories. The first sign of trouble arrived at TechFlow's offices on Wednesday afternoon in the form of a certified letter from the Delaware Secretary of State's office. Marcus's assistant brought it to his attention with routine efficiency, assuming it was standard corporate paperwork that required his signature. Marcus opened the envelope without concern, expecting to find the usual bureaucratic forms that accompanied running a public company. Instead, he discovered a formal notification that a special shareholders meeting had been requested by an investor holding sufficient shares to trigger the mandatory gathering. The language was dense with legal terminology, but the basic message was clear. Someone with significant ownership in TechFlow Solutions was demanding a meeting to discuss matters of corporate governance and strategic direction. Marcus read the document 3 times, his confidence gradually giving way to confusion and then concern. He immediately called his corporate lawyer, a sharp partner at one of the city's most prestigious firms who had handled TechFlow's legal matters since the company's early days. The conversation was tense and filled with technical discussions about ownership percentages, voting rights, and the mysterious identity of the investor who had triggered the meeting. Marcus, his lawyer explained with careful precision, someone has accumulated enough shares in your company to force a shareholder meeting. The purchases were made through multiple entities, so we can't immediately identify the buyer, but they clearly have significant resources and sophisticated legal advice. Marcus felt the first real stirring of anxiety he had experienced since firing David, but he quickly pushed the feeling aside with characteristic arrogance. How much trouble can one investor cause? He asked dismissively. I still control the majority of the company, and I've got the board's complete support. His lawyer's silence was ominous before he finally responded. That depends entirely on who this investor is and what they want to accomplish. The fact that they've been so careful to mask their identity suggests this isn't a routine investment. Someone is playing a very sophisticated game, and they've managed to acquire a significant position without us even noticing. Marcus ended the call with forced confidence, assuring his lawyer that whatever minor shareholder drama was unfolding would be easily managed. But privately, he was beginning to feel the first cracks in his sense of absolute control, though he was still far from understanding the true scope of the threat he was facing. That evening, Elena returned home with another leather portfolio and the satisfied expression of someone whose carefully laid plans were proceeding exactly on schedule. David looked up from his laptop, where he had been applying for positions that were increasingly beneath his qualifications, and noticed that his wife seemed energized rather than exhausted by her mysterious daily activities. Elena, he said hesitantly, I know you're trying to help with our situation, but I'm starting to worry about what you're doing during the day. You seem to be handling some kind of business that requires a lot of meetings and paperwork, and I don't understand how that's possible given our circumstances. Elena sat beside him on the couch and took his hands in hers, her eyes sparkling with secrets she wasn't quite ready to reveal. David, she said softly, I need you to trust me for just a little bit longer. I know this is hard, and I know you're scared about our future. But some things are happening that are going to change everything for us. and Marcus Chun is about to discover that he's made enemies he didn't even know existed. Before David could press for more details, Elena's phone rang with another call that sent her retreating to their bedroom for a conversation conducted in the low, authoritative tones that had become her trademark. David could hear fragments of discussion about shareholder meetings, corporate governance, and strategic timing that made no sense in the context of their supposed financial crisis. Meanwhile, Marcus was working late in his office, trying to identify the mysterious investor who had triggered the unwanted shareholder meeting. His investigation had yielded only frustration, as the network of shell companies and investment vehicles seemed designed specifically to prevent identification of their ultimate controller. He stood at his floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out over the city lights and trying to convince himself that whatever minor challenge he was facing could be handled with the same aggressive tactics that had served him throughout his career. Marcus Chun had built his empire by being smarter and more ruthless than his competitors, and he was confident that one anonymous investor would be no match for his experience and connections. But deep in his gut, Marcus was beginning to feel something he hadn't experienced in years: genuine uncertainty about his ability to control the situation. The careful anonymity of his opponent suggested a level of sophistication and resources that he had never encountered before, and for the first time since building his company, Marcus was facing a challenge he couldn't simply intimidate or bully into submission. As Thursday morning dawned over the city, Elena was already at work in the conference room of a prestigious law firm, reviewing final documents with a team of lawyers and financial experts whose combined expertise represented decades of corporate warfare experience. Her transformation from the modest housewife who had comforted David through his firing to the commanding executive who was orchestrating Marcus's destruction was complete and terrifying. The pieces of her plan were moving into position with clockwork precision, and Marcus Chun was about to discover that some people are far more dangerous when they're underestimated than when they're feared. The shareholder meeting he was dreading would be just the beginning of his education about the true cost of cruelty and the devastating consequences of destroying innocent people for personal satisfaction. Elena's patience was about to be rewarded, David's suffering was about to be vindicated, and Marcus's empire was about to learn that arrogance is the most expensive luxury a successful person can afford. Should I continue with Chapter 4? Please let me know when you're ready for me to proceed to the next chapter. The emergency meeting notice arrived at TechFlow Solutions at precisely 9:30 on Friday morning, delivered by a courier service that specialized in high-priority corporate communications. Marcus Chin's assistant brought the thick envelope to his office with obvious concern, noting the urgent delivery requirements and the prestigious law firm's return address that commanded immediate attention. Marcus tore open the envelope with growing dread, his hands trembling slightly as he unfolded documents that would fundamentally alter his understanding of power, control, and his own vulnerability. The letterhead belonged to Harrison, Webb & Associates, a firm whose client list read like a directory of Fortune 500 companies and whose partners were known for representing only the most sophisticated and well-funded corporate interests. The message was devastatingly simple in its implications, though wrapped in the precise legal language that made corporate warfare an art form. The mysterious investor who had been quietly accumulating TechFlow shares had crossed the threshold from significant stakeholder to controlling interest, now owning 51% of the company's outstanding stock. Marcus read the document 3 times before the full meaning penetrated his shocked consciousness. Someone had systematically purchased control of his company while he celebrated his triumph and bragged about his decisive leadership. The empire he had built through years of aggressive tactics and ruthless decision-making was no longer his to command. The legal notice demanded an emergency board meeting within 72 hours to discuss matters of corporate governance and strategic direction. The language was formal and procedural, but Marcus could read between the lines well enough to understand that he was being summoned to witness his own professional execution. His hands shaking with rage and disbelief, Marcus immediately called his corporate lawyer, who answered on the first ring with the grim efficiency of someone who had been expecting this conversation. "Marcus," the lawyer said without preamble, "we need to meet immediately. This situation is more serious than anything we discussed earlier in the week." "Who is it?" Marcus demanded, his voice cracking with strain. Who has enough money to buy control of my company without me knowing about it? I want names, backgrounds, financial records, everything you can find on these shell companies and investment vehicles. The lawyer's silence stretched uncomfortably before he finally responded with the careful tone of someone delivering terminal news. That's what we need to discuss in person, Marcus. Our investigation has revealed some very unexpected information about the identity of your new controlling shareholder. I think you should sit down when I tell you what we've discovered. Meanwhile, across the city in their modest apartment, Elena was finally ready to share the truth that would reshape David's understanding of everything he thought he knew about his wife, their marriage, and his own future. She had spent the morning making final preparations, reviewing documents, and steeling herself for a conversation that would change their lives forever. David was hunched over his laptop at their small kitchen table, mechanically submitting applications for positions that were far beneath his qualifications while trying to maintain some semblance of hope about their financial situation. The stress of unemployment had aged him visibly, adding gray to his temples and lines around his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and overwhelming worry. Elena approached him with 2 cups of coffee and the leather portfolio that had become her constant companion during the past week. She set the coffee beside his laptop and gently closed the computer screen, her actions signaling that their conversation would be too important for distractions. "David," she said softly, sitting across from him at the table they had purchased together during happier times, "I need to tell you something that's going to be very difficult to understand. Something about who I really am and why I've been keeping secrets that I should have shared with you years ago." David looked up with concern, noting the seriousness in Elena's voice and the formal way she had positioned herself across from him. His mind immediately jumped to worst-case scenarios involving illness, debt, or legal troubles that would compound their already desperate circumstances. Elena opened her portfolio and removed a stack of documents that looked like legal papers, financial statements, and official certificates bearing impressive seals and signatures. She spread them on the table between them like a poker player revealing a winning hand that would shock everyone at the table. "David," Elena began, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was about to reveal, "my family built one of the first successful technology companies in Silicon Valley during the 1980s. My father was a pioneer in computer networking, and my mother was a brilliant engineer who held dozens of patents in telecommunications systems." David stared at the documents spread before him, his mind struggling to process information that contradicted everything he thought he knew about his wife's background. The papers included stock certificates, trust fund statements, and educational records that painted a picture of wealth and privilege that seemed impossible given their modest lifestyle. "When my parents died in that car accident 8 years ago," Elena continued, her voice taking on the matter-of-fact tone of someone discussing business rather than tragedy, "I inherited their entire estate. The company had been sold years earlier, but the proceeds were invested wisely and had grown into a substantial fortune." She pointed to specific documents that showed investment portfolios worth tens of millions of dollars, real estate holdings in prime locations, and trust fund distributions that dwarfed the combined salaries David had earned throughout his entire career. The numbers were so large they seemed fictional, like play money in an elaborate game rather than real wealth that could change lives. "But why?" David asked in a voice barely above a whisper. "Why would you hide something like this from me? Why would we struggle with bills and live in this tiny apartment when you have access to this kind of money? Why would you let me suffer through unemployment when you could solve all our problems with a phone call?" Elena reached across the table and took his hands in hers, her eyes filled with a mixture of love and sadness that spoke of difficult choices made for reasons she hoped he would understand. "Because I needed to know that you loved me for who I am, not for what I have," she said simply. "I needed to know that our marriage was built on genuine connection rather than financial convenience." She explained how previous relationships had been poisoned by gold diggers and opportunists who saw her wealth rather than her personality. Men who had courted her inheritance while ignoring her intelligence, dreams, and emotional needs. The pattern had repeated so often that Elena had begun to believe genuine love was impossible for someone in her position. "So I decided to live modestly and quietly," she continued, her voice growing stronger as she shared the reasoning behind her deception. "I wanted to find someone who would love Elena the person, not Elena the heiress. Someone who would value my character over my bank account and my heart over my financial statements. David sat in stunned silence, trying to reconcile the woman he had married with the wealthy executive described in the documents before him. The Elena he knew was practical and frugal, careful with every dollar and thoughtful about every purchase. The idea that she had been consciously choosing poverty while possessing vast wealth was almost impossible to comprehend. The documents revealed that Elena held advanced degrees from Harvard Business School and MIT, credentials that would have impressed even Marcus Chun if he had bothered to investigate the background of the woman he had dismissed as powerless deadweight. Her transcripts showed academic excellence in corporate strategy, finance, and technology management that qualified her to run companies rather than simply invest in them. Elena watched David's face as he absorbed the magnitude of her revelation, seeing the shock gradually give way to understanding and then to something that looked remarkably like relief. For the first time in weeks, the crushing weight of financial worry was lifting from his shoulders, replaced by the strange sensation of discovering that everything he thought he knew about his life had been fundamentally wrong. "You mean all this time," David said slowly, "while I've been panicking about rent and bills and our future, you could have solved everything instantly. While I've been applying for minimum wage jobs and worrying about our survival, you've been sitting on enough money to buy the entire building we live in." Elena nodded, her eyes searching his face for signs of anger or betrayal that would indicate her gamble had failed. "I know how difficult this must be to understand," she said carefully. "I know it seems cruel that I let you suffer when I could have prevented it. But I needed to know that our love was real before I could trust you with the complete truth about who I am." David stood and walked to the window, staring out at the modest neighborhood they called home, while his mind struggled to process the complete reversal of everything he thought he understood about their circumstances. The stress and worry that had been crushing him for weeks suddenly seemed like elaborate theater, a performance he had been unknowingly acting in while the real drama played out behind scenes he couldn't see. "But why now?" he asked, turning back to face his wife with a mixture of confusion and growing excitement. "Why are you telling me this today, instead of continuing to keep it secret? What's changed that makes the truth necessary now?" Elena smiled, and for the first time since David's firing, her expression held genuine anticipation rather than carefully maintained optimism. "Because," she said with quiet satisfaction, "Marcus Chun is about to discover that the powerless housewife he mocked and dismissed has just become the controlling owner of his company." The words hit David like a physical shock, and he gripped the back of his chair for support as the full implications of Elena's revelation became clear. The mysterious investor who had been buying TechFlow shares wasn't some faceless corporate raider or foreign entity. It was his own wife, using her vast resources to systematically acquire control of the company that had destroyed his career and humiliated them both. "You bought TechFlow Solutions," David said in amazement, his voice rising with incredulous excitement. "You actually bought the entire company out from under Marcus while he was celebrating and bragging about his success." Elena nodded, her satisfaction evident as she watched her husband finally understand the scope of the justice that was about to be delivered. 51% controlling interest, she confirmed with the precise tone of someone who had planned every detail of a complex corporate acquisition, purchased through multiple shell companies and investment vehicles to prevent Marcus from identifying the buyer until it was too late to stop the process. She explained how her team of lawyers and financial advisors had been working for months to structure the purchase in a way that would maximize Marcus's shock and minimize his ability to mount any effective defense. Every share acquisition had been carefully timed and strategically executed to avoid triggering disclosure requirements until the controlling threshold had been crossed. David sank back into his chair, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what Elena had accomplished while he struggled with unemployment and despair. The woman he had married was not just wealthy, but strategically brilliant, capable of corporate warfare at a level that made Marcus's aggressive tactics look like playground bullying. Elena moved around the table to stand beside her husband, her hand resting gently on his shoulder as she continued her explanation. "Marcus Chun is going to walk into that emergency board meeting thinking he's dealing with some anonymous investor who wants to negotiate or compromise," she said with quiet confidence. "Instead, he's going to discover that the woman whose husband he fired and humiliated now owns his company and controls his future. The justice of the situation was so perfect it seemed almost fictional, but the documents spread across their kitchen table provided undeniable proof that Elena's patient revenge was about to reach its devastating conclusion. Marcus's moment of cruel triumph had planted the seeds of his own destruction, and Elena's careful cultivation of those seeds was about to bear fruit that would reshape the entire technology industry. David looked up at his wife with newfound respect and amazement, seeing her clearly for perhaps the first time since their marriage. The modest housewife who had comforted him through his unemployment was also a corporate strategist capable of acquiring companies and destroying enemies with surgical precision. "What happens next?" he asked, his voice filled with anticipation rather than worry for the first time in weeks. Elena smiled with the confidence of someone whose carefully laid plans were about to reach their perfect conclusion. "Next," she said simply, "Marcus Chen learns that underestimating people can be a very expensive mistake. Should I continue with Chapter 5? Please let me know when you're ready for me to proceed to the next chapter." The boardroom at TechFlow Solutions had never hosted a meeting quite like this one. Marcus Chen arrived 20 minutes early, dressed in his most expensive suit, and armed with carefully prepared talking points designed to maintain control over whatever challenge was about to unfold. He positioned himself at the head of the polished conference table, determined to remind everyone present that this was still his company and his kingdom. The other board members filed in with obvious tension, their usual casual confidence replaced by nervous energy that comes from uncertainty about power dynamics and corporate politics. These were seasoned executives who had weathered countless corporate storms, but the mysterious circumstances surrounding today's emergency meeting had them all on edge. Marcus's lawyer sat to his right, surrounded by thick folders containing research on shell companies, investment strategies, and potential defenses against hostile takeovers. Despite their extensive investigation, they had been unable to identify the mysterious investor beyond confirming that whoever had orchestrated this acquisition possessed sophisticated legal advice and virtually unlimited financial resources. At exactly 10 o'clock, the conference room doors opened to admit a legal team that immediately commanded attention through their sheer presence and obvious expense. 3 lawyers from Harrison, Webb and Associates entered first, carrying briefcases and tablet computers with the efficient precision of professionals who specialized in high-stakes corporate warfare. Behind them walked a woman whose appearance would have stopped conversations in any boardroom in the country. Elena Martinez had transformed herself completely from the modest housewife who had comforted David through his unemployment into a commanding executive whose every detail spoke of power, wealth, and absolute confidence in her position. Her charcoal gray suit was perfectly tailored and obviously expensive. Her jewelry was understated but unmistakably valuable, and her bearing carried the authority of someone accustomed to controlling rooms full of powerful people. She moved with the fluid grace of a natural leader, her eyes scanning the assembled board members with the calculating assessment of a general surveying a battlefield. Marcus felt his mouth go dry as recognition dawned with devastating clarity. The mysterious investor who had systematically acquired control of his company was not some faceless corporate raider or foreign entity. It was Elena Martinez, the unemployed wife of the employee he had fired and humiliated with such obvious pleasure just weeks earlier. The silence in the room was absolute as Elena took her place at the opposite end of the conference table from Marcus, her legal team arranging documents with practiced efficiency while every eye in the room remained fixed on her transformed presence. She had evolved from victim to victor so completely that several board members were still struggling to reconcile their memories of David's quiet wife with the commanding executive now dominating their emergency meeting. "Good morning," Elena said, her voice carrying the authoritative tone that had become familiar to David during her mysterious phone calls, but which none of these executives had ever heard before. "Thank you all for attending this emergency shareholders meeting. I know the circumstances are unusual, but I believe the matters we need to discuss will clarify everything for everyone present." Marcus tried to maintain his composure, but his face had gone pale and his hands were trembling slightly as the full implications of Elena's presence became undeniable. He had spent weeks believing he was facing some unknown corporate threat, never imagining that his greatest enemy had been hidden in plain sight. disguised as powerless deadweight he could safely ignore and abuse. Elena's lead attorney stood and presented documents to each board member with ceremonial formality, the papers rustling like autumn leaves as executives examined proof of the corporate acquisition that had occurred under their unseeing eyes. The documentation was flawless, showing a systematic accumulation of TechFlow shares through multiple investment vehicles that had culminated in Elena's controlling ownership of 61% of the company. Ms. Martinez, the attorney announced for the record, represents the controlling interest in TechFlow Solutions as of market close on Friday. All previous corporate governance structures and executive authorities are now subject to her oversight and approval as the majority shareholder. Marcus finally found his voice, though it came out as a strangled whisper rather than the commanding tone he had intended. "This is impossible," he managed to say, his eyes darting between Elena's composed face and the damning documents before him. "You're nobody. You're just an unemployed housewife with no resources or connections. How could you possibly afford to buy my company?" Elena smiled with the patient condescension of a teacher addressing a particularly slow student. "Mr. Chun," she replied calmly, "that assumption represents exactly the kind of thinking that brought you to this moment. You dismissed me as powerless because you never bothered to investigate who I really am or what resources I might possess." She gestured to her legal team, who began distributing additional documents that told the story of Elena's true background and financial position. The papers revealed her family's technology empire, her Harvard MBA, her MIT engineering credentials, and the vast inheritance that had made her corporate acquisition strategy possible. "My parents built one of the first major networking companies in Silicon Valley," Elena explained with quiet pride, her voice carrying across the silent boardroom like a sword cutting through fog. "When they died, I inherited not just their wealth, but their understanding of how technology companies succeed and fail." Marcus's board members were studying the documents with growing amazement, their faces showing the shock of executives realizing they had been completely outmaneuvered by someone they had never considered a threat. Elena's credentials were impeccable, her financial resources were vast, and her strategic planning had been executed with surgical precision. Elena stood and walked slowly around the conference table, her movement commanding attention from every person present as she began to recount the events that had led to this moment of corporate justice. On March 15th, she said with perfect recall, "You fired David Martinez for being 43 minutes late to work because his wife was suffering from stress-induced food poisoning." The specific date and circumstances landed like physical blows on Marcus, who was beginning to realize that Elena had been documenting his cruelty with the methodical precision of someone building a legal case. She continued her recitation of events with calm authority, each detail delivered with courtroom accuracy. "You told David that his wife's medical emergency was simply personal drama interfering with professional responsibilities," Elena continued, her voice never rising, but somehow becoming more intense with each accusation. "You informed him that you were tired of carrying deadweight employees who couldn't manage their personal lives properly." Marcus tried to interrupt, but Elena's lawyer held up a hand that silenced him as effectively as a judge's gavel. Elena was clearly just beginning her presentation, and the board members were hanging on every word as the true scope of Marcus's misconduct became clear. "You then spent the following weeks systematically contacting other employers in the industry to ensure that David would be unable to find comparable employment," Elena said, producing printed emails and phone records that documented Marcus's character assassination campaign. "You destroyed his reputation not for business reasons, but for personal satisfaction." The evidence was overwhelming and undeniably damning, showing Marcus's cruelty in stark detail while establishing Elena's meticulous preparation for this moment of reckoning. Board members who had previously admired Marcus's aggressive leadership style were now seeing it as evidence of dangerous instability and poor judgment. Elena returned to her position at the head of the table, her presence now completely dominating the room, while Marcus shrank into his chair like a defendant waiting for sentencing. The power dynamics had shifted so completely that even Marcus's own lawyers were looking to Elena for guidance rather than their supposed client. "During your celebration speech last week," Elena continued with devastating calm, "you described firing David as an act of compassion and moral leadership. You boasted about eliminating dead weight and raising standards, never realizing that your victim's wife was recording every word for future reference. She produced a small digital device that had captured Marcus's cruel victory speech in crystal-clear audio, his own words now serving as evidence of the arrogance and cruelty that had motivated his destruction of innocent lives. The recording played Marcus's voice celebrating David's humiliation while describing it as necessary business discipline. The board members listened with growing horror as Marcus's speech revealed the true nature of his character, his obvious pleasure in causing suffering, and his complete lack of empathy for the people whose lives he had destroyed for personal gratification. The man they had trusted to lead their company was exposed as a petty tyrant who confused cruelty with strength. Elena paused the recording and looked directly at Marcus, her eyes holding no anger or hatred, only the cold satisfaction of justice finally being served. Based on this evidence and my position as controlling shareholder, she announced with quiet authority, I am making the following changes to TechFlow Solutions' corporate structure and leadership team. Marcus tried to stand, but his legs were shaking too badly to support him, and he collapsed back into his chair while Elena continued her systematic destruction of everything he had built through years of aggressive tactics and ruthless ambition. Effective immediately, Elena declared, David Martinez is reinstated as head of development with a salary of $150,000 annually, full benefits, and stock options reflecting his true value to this organization. The board members nodded their approval, understanding that Elena's control was absolute and that resistance would be futile. They had witnessed corporate takeovers before, but never one executed with such personal precision and devastating effectiveness. Elena's voice continued with the measured cadence of someone reading a prepared judgment. Furthermore, I am implementing new corporate policies regarding employee treatment, workplace respect, and management accountability that will ensure no other TechFlow employee suffers the treatment David received. Marcus finally found his voice, though it came out as a desperate plea rather than authoritative command. You can't do this, he whispered hoarsely. I built this company from nothing. These people work for me. This is my life's work. Elena's smile held no warmth as she delivered the final blow to Marcus's crumbling empire. Actually, Mr. Chun, she replied with devastating finality, they work for me now. And your life's work just became evidence of why some people should never be trusted with power over others. The transformation was complete and irreversible, with Marcus reduced to a powerless spectator while Elena assumed command of the company he had thought was his unshakable kingdom. The quiet housewife he had dismissed as worthless deadweight had become the controlling force in his professional destruction. Elena's justice was about to be served with the precision of a master chef and the inevitability of gravity itself. Should I continue with Chapter 6? Please let me know when you're ready for me to proceed to the next chapter. Elena's voice carried across the boardroom with the authority of absolute power as she prepared to deliver the final judgment that would reshape Marcus Chin's understanding of consequences and accountability. The assembled board members sat in stunned silence, watching the complete reversal of corporate hierarchy unfold before their eyes like witnesses to a perfectly orchestrated execution. Mr. Chun, Elena said with cold formality, your employment with TechFlow Solutions is terminated, effective immediately. Your access to company systems, facilities, and resources is revoked as of this moment. Security will escort you from the building within the hour. Marcus's face went white as the words hit him with devastating finality. The casual cruelty with which Elena delivered his termination was an exact mirror of the callous dismissal he had given David, but now he was experiencing the humiliation from the victim's perspective. His mouth opened and closed soundlessly as his mind struggled to process the complete destruction of his professional identity. Elena continued with the systematic precision of someone who had planned every detail of this moment. Your personal belongings will be packed and delivered to your residence by courier service. Your company vehicle, credit cards, and all corporate assets must be surrendered before you leave the premises today. The board members watched with fascination as Marcus experienced the same powerlessness and shock that David had endured, but without the dignity and grace that had characterized the man Marcus had destroyed for sport. Where David had accepted his termination with quiet strength, Marcus was visibly crumbling under the weight of his sudden reversal of fortune. But Elena was far from finished with her demonstration of justice, served with surgical precision. She nodded to her legal team, who began distributing additional documents that would transform Marcus's professional humiliation into potential criminal liability. The papers detailed months of forensic accounting work that had uncovered systematic financial misconduct hidden within TechFlow's corporate structure. During our acquisition process, Elena announced with the calm authority of someone presenting evidence to a jury, our forensic accountants discovered several concerning irregularities in the company's financial records. These irregularities appear to constitute embezzlement, tax fraud, and misappropriation of corporate funds for personal use. Marcus tried to stand, but his legs buckled beneath him, forcing him to grip the conference table for support as Elena methodically destroyed not just his career, but his freedom. The financial evidence was overwhelming, showing years of Marcus siphoning company funds through fabricated consulting contracts, inflated expense reports, and fraudulent vendor payments that had enriched his personal accounts. The documentation revealed Marcus's systematic theft of nearly $2 million over 4 years, money that had been cleverly disguised as legitimate business expenses while actually funding his luxury lifestyle. His expensive suits, designer watches, and penthouse apartment had all been purchased with stolen corporate funds, creating a pattern of criminal behavior that would devastate any legal defense. Elena's voice remained steady as she continued her presentation of evidence that would send Marcus to prison. These financial crimes will be reported to federal authorities within 24 hours, she announced matter-of-factly. The FBI's white-collar crime division has already expressed interest in pursuing prosecution to the full extent of the law. Marcus finally found his voice, though it emerged as a desperate croak rather than the commanding tone he had once used to intimidate employees. "You planned this," he whispered accusingly. "You've been setting me up for months, gathering evidence, and building a case against me while pretending to be some helpless victim." Elena's smile was cold and absolutely merciless as she confirmed Marcus's worst fears. "Actually, Mr. Chun, I've been documenting your criminal behavior for exactly as long as it took you to reveal your true character. Every cruel word, every illegal transaction, every abuse of power has been carefully recorded and preserved for this moment." She gestured to her lawyers, who produced boxes of additional evidence including audio recordings, email transcripts, financial records, and witness statements that painted a comprehensive picture of Marcus's misconduct. The investigation had been thorough and professional, conducted with the resources and expertise that only vast wealth could command. The board members were studying the evidence with growing horror, realizing that they had unknowingly served alongside a criminal whose illegal activities had exposed the entire company to potential liability and regulatory scrutiny. Their previous admiration for Marcus's aggressive leadership was transforming into disgust and fear about their own legal exposure. Elena's presentation continued with relentless efficiency as she outlined the immediate changes that would transform TechFlow Solutions from Marcus's personal kingdom into a legitimate corporation governed by ethical standards and legal compliance. David Martinez would assume Marcus's former role with expanded authority and resources to implement the innovative projects that Marcus had suppressed out of jealousy and fear. The technical innovations that David had proposed over the years, Elena explained to the fascinated board, represent potential revenue streams worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Marcus rejected these innovations not because they lacked merit, but because he feared that David's success would threaten his own position and ego. She produced David's original project proposals, complete with technical specifications and market analysis that demonstrated their enormous commercial potential. The suppressed innovations included breakthrough algorithms, revolutionary user interfaces, and cutting-edge security protocols that could have positioned TechFlow as an industry leader years earlier. Marcus had buried these innovations not through incompetence, but through deliberate sabotage motivated by his pathological need to maintain absolute control over every aspect of the company's operations. His fear of being overshadowed by David's technical brilliance had cost TechFlow millions in lost revenue and market opportunities. Elena's systematic presentation of evidence continued as she revealed Marcus's pattern of taking credit for innovations developed by his subordinates while simultaneously suppressing any work that might threaten his perceived authority. The documentation showed years of intellectual theft disguised as managerial oversight, with Marcus claiming ownership of ideas he had neither conceived nor understood. The security team arrived precisely on schedule, their presence adding official finality to Marcus's removal from the company he had once controlled with absolute authority. They stood quietly near the conference room entrance, waiting for Elena's signal to escort the former CEO from his corporate kingdom like a common criminal being removed from the scene of his crimes. Elena stood and walked slowly around the conference table toward Marcus, her movement commanding absolute attention from every person in the room. When she reached his chair, she leaned down and spoke in a voice that only he could hear, delivering words that would haunt him for the rest of his life. "You told David that sometimes the most compassionate thing a leader can do is remove team members who lack commitment," Elena whispered with devastating intimacy. "You said that cutting dead weight isn't just good business, but a moral imperative. I want you to remember those exact words as you're escorted from the building you'll never enter again." Marcus's face crumpled as Elena straightened and addressed the security team with crisp authority. "Please escort Mr. Chun from the premises," she commanded. "Ensure that all company property is recovered and that he understands the legal consequences of any attempt to contact current employees or interfere with company operations." The security team moved with professional efficiency, flanking Marcus as he struggled to stand on legs that felt like rubber beneath him. His exit from the boardroom was witnessed by the same executives who had applauded his cruel victory speech just weeks earlier, their faces now showing the mixture of pity and relief that accompanies watching justice finally served. As the conference room doors closed behind Marcus's defeated figure, Elena turned her attention to the remaining board members with the commanding presence of someone who had just demonstrated exactly what happened to people who underestimated her intelligence and resources. "Ladies and gentlemen," she announced with satisfaction, "we have significant work ahead of us to rebuild this company's culture and restore its reputation in the industry. I expect your complete cooperation in implementing the changes necessary to ensure that TechFlow Solutions becomes a model of ethical leadership and employee treatment." The board members nodded their agreement with obvious relief, understanding that Elena's leadership would be demanding but fair, in sharp contrast to Marcus's reign of terror and abuse. They had witnessed her methodical destruction of their former leader and had no desire to experience her attention as adversaries rather than allies. Elena spent the next hour outlining her vision for TechFlow's transformation, emphasizing innovation, employee respect, and sustainable growth over the aggressive tactics and short-term thinking that had characterized Marcus's management style. Her proposals were sophisticated and well-researched, demonstrating the business acumen that her Harvard MBA and family background had provided. Meanwhile, David Martinez was experiencing his own transformation as news of the corporate upheaval reached the development team through carefully managed internal communications. Elena had personally called him that morning to explain that his reinstatement was effective immediately, along with a promotion, substantial raise, and the resources necessary to implement every innovation Marcus had suppressed. The development team gathered around David's restored workstation with expressions ranging from amazement to vindication, their faces showing the relief of employees who had witnessed injustice and feared for their own job security under Marcus's unpredictable leadership. Several team members approached David with quiet apologies for their failure to support him during his termination. Tom Wilson, the developer who had encountered David at the grocery store, spoke for the group with obvious shame in his voice. "David, I want to apologize for not standing up for you when Marcus fired you so unfairly," he said quietly. "We all knew it was wrong, but we were afraid of becoming his next target. Your wife was right when she said the best strategy was to observe carefully and choose your moments thoughtfully." David accepted their apologies with the grace that had characterized his behavior throughout the ordeal, understanding that fear was a powerful motivator and that not everyone possessed Elena's resources for fighting back against institutional cruelty. His focus was on moving forward rather than harboring resentment against colleagues who had been victims of Marcus's intimidation tactics. The implementation of David's suppressed innovations proceeded with remarkable speed and efficiency, aided by Elena's unlimited resources and her insistence on hiring the best available talent to support the technical development process. Projects that Marcus had killed out of jealousy were resurrected and given priority status, with development budgets that allowed for proper staffing and cutting-edge equipment. Within 3 months, TechFlow Solutions had become the most desirable employer in the regional technology sector, with Elena's ethical leadership policies attracting top talent from competitors who still operated under traditional hierarchical management structures. The company's culture transformation was so dramatic that it became a case study in business schools and management consulting firms. David thrived in his expanded leadership role, his confidence restored by Elena's faith in his abilities and the tangible evidence that his innovations were generating substantial revenue and industry recognition. The quiet engineer who had accepted his termination with dignity had evolved into a respected technical leader whose work was reshaping entire segments of the technology market. Elena divided her time between TechFlow's strategic oversight and her expanding portfolio of investments in companies led by underestimated individuals who possessed exceptional talent but lacked the resources to compete with established industry leaders. Her wealth had become a weapon against institutional cruelty and systemic injustice, wielded with the precision of a surgeon and the patience of a chess master. 6 months after Marcus's humiliating termination, Elena received reports from her private investigators about his current circumstances that provided satisfying confirmation that justice had been thoroughly served. The former technology executive was working the night shift at a 24-hour convenience store, his criminal conviction having made him unemployable in any professional capacity. Marcus's penthouse apartment had been seized to pay restitution for his embezzlement. His luxury vehicles had been sold at auction, and his expensive wardrobe had been donated to charity after his legal fees consumed every asset he had accumulated through years of theft and corruption. The man who had once bragged about his decisive leadership was now scanning barcodes and cleaning restrooms for minimum wage. His industry reputation was so thoroughly destroyed that former colleagues crossed the street to avoid acknowledging his presence, and his name had become synonymous with executive misconduct in business publications that analyzed corporate failures. The empire he had built through intimidation and cruelty had collapsed so completely that it seemed like it had never existed. Elena's marriage to David had grown stronger through their shared experience of injustice and vindication, with David's newfound understanding of his wife's true capabilities adding layers of respect and admiration to their existing foundation of love. Their modest apartment had been replaced by a beautiful home, but more importantly, their relationship had been purified by the knowledge that their love had survived the test of genuine hardship. On a quiet Sunday evening exactly 1 year after Marcus had fired David with such obvious cruelty, Elena sat in her home office reviewing applications from another underestimated individual who had contacted her foundation for assistance. Sarah Chun, no relation to Marcus despite the shared surname, was a brilliant software engineer whose former employer had terminated her for refusing sexual advances from her supervisor. Elena smiled as she read Sarah's technical proposals and reviewed the evidence of workplace harassment that had destroyed her career prospects in a male-dominated industry. The case had all the elements Elena looked for when selecting recipients for her special brand of justice: genuine talent destroyed by institutional cruelty, clear evidence of misconduct, and an opportunity to demonstrate that underestimating people can be a very expensive mistake. Elena picked up her phone and dialed Sarah's number, her voice carrying the warm confidence of someone about to change another person's life in ways they couldn't yet imagine. "Sarah, this is Elena Martinez from the Martinez Foundation," she said with anticipation. "I've reviewed your application and I think we need to meet in person to discuss some very interesting opportunities." As she scheduled the meeting that would begin another campaign of perfectly orchestrated justice, Elena reflected on the profound satisfaction that came from using her resources to protect the innocent and punish those who abused their power over others. Marcus Chin had taught her that some people mistake kindness for weakness and mistake silence for acceptance, but he had learned too late that his lesson was incomplete. The most dangerous people in the world, Elena had discovered, were not those who announced their strength with threats and intimidation, but those who possessed the patience to document injustice, the resources to fight institutional power, and the strategic intelligence to wait for the perfect moment to demonstrate that every cruel action eventually finds its perfect consequence. Whether you've experienced workplace bullying yourself or you've witnessed someone else being treated unfairly, Elena's story reminds us that justice may be delayed, but it's rarely denied when the right person decides to fight back with intelligence and resources. Have you ever seen someone who seemed powerless turn the tables on their oppressor in a way that completely shocked everyone involved? Share your thoughts in the comments about whether you think Elena's revenge was justified or if you've witnessed similar situations where the underestimated person ultimately triumphed over their tormentors. This concludes our complete story of Elena Martinez and her perfect revenge against Marcus Chun. The final chapter has delivered total justice, while showing the lasting positive transformation of everyone involved except the person who truly deserved to lose everything.